Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to try to be as conversational as I can, although I think I'm going to talk for a while and then you guys are going to ask a bunch of questions at the end. And so we'll try to stop in about an hour for that. Is the sound okay? Yes. Okay. I'm not used to being amplified, so you're going to see me adjust to that over the next few minutes. I want to focus on what dysregulation is, sort of just thinking about that together for a minute. What produces dysregulation, sort of kind of what are we thinking about, and then what are we going to do about it? So dysregulation is, this is sort of a basic dictionary definition, a failure to regulate properly. Difficulty with behavior, emotion, attention, or sensory input. One way or another, difficulty regulating the kinds of inputs that you're dealing with. It leads to emotion overload and cognitive overload. Do you guys have, actually, one thing I forgot to ask you all, I would love to know who is in the room. How many of you are a parent of, okay. How many are here because you do something related to helping kids professionally? Okay, great. Okay, how many of you are a parent of somebody in elementary school? All right, middle school, high school, and then beyond high school? Okay, all right. How many of you are raising a child that has some sort of a learning difference or unique need? Okay, everybody, great, got it. Okay, all right. So my guess is, looking at lab school talks in the past, and how many of you guys have been to a talk, something like somebody talking here or someplace like that about something related? Okay, all right. So there's a lot of stuff you guys already know, and I'm going to try not to spend a lot of time talking about stuff you've probably heard before. You're going to see, you guys have all got the handout, you're going to see there's more information than can reasonably be covered in an hour. So we're going to try to focus on what I hope is going to be the most interesting or the most perhaps novel information. And you guys will help me get there. Hopefully you won't fall asleep, and by the time we get to the end you'll be able to help it be focused and interesting. But I do think it's worth thinking about dysregulation, dividing it into if you're emotionally dysregulated or you're cognitively dysregulated. So we're going to think about each of those two in turn. The first part I want to do is thinking about the underlying causes of dysregulation. Here's 5 major categories of reasons why somebody might be dysregulated. Developmental immaturity, meaning that you're 5 years old, but developmentally you're 3 years old, or you're 12 years old, but developmentally you're 7 years old. Difficulty with attention or executive functioning, we're going to unpack that a bit. Difficulty with processing speed, we'll unpack that a bit. Just being sensitive, some of us are sensitive. Lots of strengths in being sensitive, but until you sort of figure out being sensitive, it's hard, right? And then sometimes dysregulation is because I can't tell you directly what's going on with me. Okay. Developmental immaturity, let's go there first. Think about your 2-year-old, your 3-year-old, and then when he or she was 8 or 9 or 10 years old. You can, as you mature, you can handle more information, you can take on more information. But if there's a disconnect, right? If I'm 8 years old chronologically, but emotionally, in terms of how I process information, how I absorb the environment, I'm 7 years old or 6 years old, that disconnect creates dysregulation because everybody looks at me and I look 8 years old, but inside I'm still 5 years old. And that means you're placing all of the demands and expectations on me based on my age, but not how old I actually am. And if we can sort of pin that, if we can recognize, I'm going to use ADHD as an example. Most kids with ADHD are somewhere between 2 and 3 years behind emotionally in terms of how they process information, in terms of how they cope. So if we take that 8-year-old, we give them an 8-year-old curriculum, but we expect them to self-manage, to deal with emotions, to deal with frustration tolerance like a 5-year-old, they're probably going to look a lot less dysregulated. That's the idea there. What about this one? Highly gifted children. Is anybody surprised to see that on there? Nobody's surprised to see that. Okay, that's good. What happens with the majority, maybe not the majority, but a lot of kids who are highly, highly gifted is there's a disconnect between how easily they process information, like information on NPR, information in books, visual spatial information, and how easily they process emotional information. And that difference creates just a sense of feeling discombobulated, and that itself can produce this dysregulation, this inability to self-manage. And then, of course, the last thing is just having unreasonable expectations. That teacher, that coach, that neighbor, that aunt, that uncle who is talking to your 8-year-old like they're a college student and can't really understand why they're not keeping up with it. Good example of unreasonable expectations. Okay. Attention and executive functioning. This is something you guys have heard a lot about. This naturally produces dysregulation. What ADHD is, in its essence, is the ability to sustain focused attention when it's important but boring. And of course, that scales by age. Being 5 years old, what we think is reasonable attention is different than 8 years old or 15 years old or 20 years old. And so if you're 2 to 3 years below expectations simply because you have ADHD, you're going to look dysregulated. Here's something that not everybody knows. If you look at the description, the definition of ADHD, we see difficulty with the regulation of attention and difficulty with the regulation of behavior. So that would be the fidgetiness, the hyperactivity, the difficulty with impulsivity. But another big piece of it is the difficulty with the regulation of emotions. Is that something that you guys have heard before? Some of you? Sure. So probably the easiest way to talk about it is sometime last summer, summer of 2017, a major study came out looking at kids through adulthood that have ADHD and looking across, it was a meta-analysis looking across a whole range of studies to taking brain imaging research and other types of data. And what they demonstrated is that individuals with ADHD often have difficulty regulating their emotions. We see it clinically all the time. We see a child with ADHD, we get them on medicine or we get them stabilized in some other way, and suddenly they're less reactive, they're less irritable, they break down less, they cry less, i.e. they're better regulated. And it makes sense. There's very few parts of the brain that do just one thing. So the part of your brain that regulates walking and pacing also regulates other sorts of sequencing and pacing sort of timing behaviors. The part of your brain that regulates attention also regulates behavior, right? So you've got the motor cortex that regulates sort of how you move your body, but the actual pacing of when you move your body, the decisions, is in the frontal lobe. So it would make sense if the frontal lobe regulates attention and it regulates behavior, it would also regulate emotions. It doesn't produce emotions, but it helps to temper and scale those emotions. And so if you've got an underactive frontal lobe, if you've got an underactive front part of your brain, and medicine helps stabilize that, sort of brings it up to a normal baseline, it makes sense that your emotions would better regulate as a result of that. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Then we've got organization and information processing, which I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about. Flexibility, which I think is no big surprise. I think sometimes we use anxiety and inflexibility interchangeably. Almost, it depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to your therapist, it's anxiety. And if you're talking to a neurologist or a neuropsychologist or somebody like that, they just call it flexibility. And then we're going to talk about the impact on not being able to complete tasks with much efficiency. Okay. We are taking in information constantly. And if I don't know how to file that information, if I don't know how to contextualize it, because I can't see the big picture, I can't see the framework that it fits within, how quickly am I going to overload? How many pieces of information can I give you before you're going to be completely overwhelmed and exhausted? Right? I don't, maybe it's 3, maybe it's 30, but at some point you're going to exhaust. And if you don't have the structure to do it, if there's not sort of a framework that you're using, you're going to hit that exhaustion point much more quickly. Far earlier than expected by the person that's talking to you, and far earlier than expected for your development, and far earlier than you expect. You're going to be sitting there thinking, why am I getting completely overwhelmed and overloaded? Except if you're 7 years old, that's not the language you're going to use. The language you're going to use is a temper tantrum, maybe, or it's going to be retreat or withdrawal, or I feel stupid, or how come all of the kids next to me seem to get it, but I don't? You guys still with me? Okay, all right. So this is the sort of the downstream consequences of this. Information's not filed in a meaningful way. It makes multitasking incredibly hard. It's really hard to break down complex tasks. You have difficulty with big picture thinking, and you get overloaded. Let me move us on. Okay, processing speed. So lab school is one of those places that really gets processing speed. I don't know how many of you have a student here. For how many of you guys is processing speed just something you've thought about, sort of how quickly you guys take in and make sense of information? Half to 2/3 of you, maybe even more than that, right? So processing speed, the way I want you to think about it isn't your thinking speed, although sometimes it is, and it's not your ability to solve big problems. It's how quickly you visually scan, or how quickly you take in information, and then how quickly you spit it back out. It's not thinking speed. It is thinking efficiency. Those things are slightly different. It's tightly connected. I can't think of her first name. I think Kathleen McGrath gave a talk here maybe 2 or 3 years ago on this. And she's got some data, and there's some other data showing that processing speed is connected to all of these learning differences, about a 40% overlap, meaning about 40% of the time, if you've got one of these learning differences, you process information slowly. But how does that tie into dysregulation? It gets back into this overload idea. So here's a model. In fact, this came, if any of you were at that slide, I'm pretty sure that I got this from her. So I'm not taking credit for this particular slide. But if you've got slow processing speed, it's going to lead to academic, language, social, stress problems because you just can't keep up. It's not that you're not smart enough. It's not that the information is over your head. It's that the volume of information exceeds your capacity, not because you can't deal with a lot of information, but because the amount of time information sits in your head is time limited. Your working memory, sort of like the working memory is you look back, those of you that are my age know what a phone book is, and you can sort of look up a phone number and then punch it in, right? That's your working memory, holding that 7 or 10 digit number in your head long enough to dial it. So that's finite. It lasts, unless you're doing some sort of rehearsal strategy, it lasts 5, 7, 9 seconds, something like that. But if you've got slow processing speed, what happens is the number of pieces of information you can hold just got a lot smaller because it takes you a longer amount of time to absorb each piece of information. And so the information you started with decays, meaning it just kind of goes away, before the next pieces of information get in, which just slows down everything. So normally, if you're processing at a normal pace, maybe what would happen is you'd be able to get through 5 pieces of information before the first one starts to decay. But with slow processing speed, you're only getting through 2 or 3. Do you guys see how that sort of has this exponential impact on how quickly and how much information you can absorb, and how just if you don't have an appreciation for that, sort of as a parent, as a coach, as a teacher, that you're going to very quickly overwhelm the person in front of you? And when you're a child, when you get overwhelmed, you get emotionally dysregulated. I've got some slides that will point to that. So you end up feeling inadequate, whether it's socially because you can't keep up in the conversation, or academically, or you guys can read it. So for any of these reasons, and so then you start to feel crummy. And depending on your temperament, depending on the modeling, depending on your biology, you might internalize or externalize. So you might get anxious, or you might get angry, or some combination thereof. That's going to cause exhaustion, fatigue. It's going to make you want to be more perfectionistic because you're trying to get control over the situation. So if I can just make these things exactly right, then maybe everything will be okay. Do you guys recognize that, right? Like how that perfectionism sort of comes from being worried about something. All of that, and then it can impact motivation, and it can make you sort of more vigilant. I'm not going to get into the details of how that works. But all of this takes a toll, and guess what? It makes you even slower. And then it becomes this vicious cycle because there's this psychological overlay of not feeling good, not feeling optimistic, having negative experiences in the past. And you bring all of this, like sort of a bunch of chains just weighed upon you. You bring all of this with you to the next time you try it. And it saps cognitive resources, and it slows you down further, and then you have even worse performance. If you think about that, and then you think about how resilient your kids are, right? Think about how many times your 7-year-old or your 9-year-old, if this is any sort of a pattern, that they got up the next morning and still went to school, still tried it with the teacher again, still tried again to read. It's incredible, the amount of resilience we see in kids. Even the ones that like sort of you feel like they're brittle and they're fragile and all of that, they still get up every day. It's just amazing. Okay, what about dysregulation as communication? So what am I talking about here? First bullet I've got here is your bandwidth has been exceeded. So let's think for a minute what happens when we dysregulate. It means that something fundamentally broke. So if we're thinking about sort of the big picture dysregulation, like sort of we've really crossed a line, that means that I'm on the floor having a temper tantrum, right? I'm kicking and stomping. I'm not productively engaging in problem solving. I've lost it. Right? Does that sound like dysregulation? And I can lose it in a lot of different ways, but somehow I'm no longer available for learning, and I'm no longer reachable, right? This is the time when you say, I'll give you $20 if you stop having a tantrum, and they tear up the $20 bill, right? Right? Like that's right. So what does that mean? It means I'm engaging in counterproductive behavior. I'm completely overwhelmed. So when that happens, our bandwidth, right? If we sort of pull it out of the emotional language and into like out of the behavior and just think about what's happening, it means my bandwidth has been exceeded. Chances are I feel helpless. I guarantee you feel stuck. The child that's there, whether that child's 23 or 15 or 3, I guarantee that that child is not doing that because he wants to. It's not like, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm bored. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have a complete meltdown, and I'm just going to lose it, and I'm going to, right? Like, that's not how it works, right? Kids don't think meltdowns are fun. That's just not how it flows. So for sure, they're feeling helpless and they're feeling stuck. And there's often this sense of, I'm beating my head against this wall over and over and over again, and I'm not making any headway, and my teacher is saying, you just need to try harder, and, and it's like, but I don't even understand what that means. I'm just stuck. Typically, in those situations, especially if you're a child, it's the very rare child that has the capacity to explain what's going on internally. They may recognize what's going on internally if you label it for them, but it's a very thin slice of kids, let alone adults, let alone kids, that can actually describe what that experience is when they're that overwhelmed and overloaded. So what might be happening is they might be trying to tell you something like, I'm overwhelmed, I'm overloaded, this is too much. You're asking me to do something that I fundamentally can't do, right? Like, the easiest way for me to picture this is, at least when my 3-year-old was, she's now 9, but when she was 3, and we would go, you guys are local, right? You'd go to Cactus, because Cactus is where you take your kids because they can run ruckus all over the place. But if I take her at 5:30, we're good. If I take her at 8:30, we got 20 minutes before she's melting down left, right, and center, because I'm past her bedtime, right? She's completely spent. And so she's just going to be a puddle on the floor. And what she's telling me is, I need to go to bed, but she doesn't have the words to say that, right? That's like one way to sort of think about her being a puddle on the floor. So that's one way, it's communication, or a couple of ways. And then there's this last bit, right? There's not enough time to express what's happening. So I think about, I've got a couple of different guys I work with that process language slowly. They need information to come. They can handle super complex information so long as the pacing is more like this, and we keep our sentences to 5 or 7 words. Then we're good. But I don't talk like that. I talk in longer sentences and at a faster pace. You guys probably do as well. And so if I keep doing that, and I expect him to keep up, he's going to stop. He's, in terms of his regulation, he's not going to be a puddle on the floor because he's now 20, but when he was 9, he was a puddle on the floor. He can't keep up. And so, again, it might be communicating something is going too much, too fast. Make sense? Okay. All right. How about students with learning differences? There's a whole other set of challenges here. In addition to some version of all of what I described applies to most kids with learning differences, with some facet of it or another. But if they've had them for a while and they haven't been at a place that gets it, that sort of really gets it, then they might think they're not very smart. They might think there's something fundamentally wrong with them. And they're going to feel inferior to their peers. Now just imagine carrying that with you into the workplace, right? I'm not as smart as the person sitting next to me. I'm not as well liked by my boss. I seem to chronically disappoint my immediate supervisor. And then go to work every day and try to do your best, right? That's sort of what we're talking about. It's hard. Just as a kind of a visual to try to capture this. So if you've got gaps in your performance abilities that are contrasted with the expectations you have for yourself, your skills are developed unevenly, and I guess expectations for yourself that your parents have for you, that the school, that society has for you, it totally makes sense that you might feel anxious and emotionally overloaded, i.e. dysregulated. I think the first thing we have is stress, and then we have this anxiety, especially if there's an attention component to it. So you guys have probably heard this before as well. If you really struggle to regulate your attention and it's unidentified, especially if you're a girl, but it doesn't have to just be if you're a girl, if you struggle to regulate attention and that bothers you, right? You've got the kiddo with ADHD that is really happy to be looking out the window or playing with his shoelaces, and whatever's going on around him, no big deal. And then you've got the one who is beside himself or beside herself because all the kids are lining up and I was playing with my shoelaces and I have no idea why everybody's lining up, and it completely freaks me out. Like, what just happened? What did I miss? So one way you can cope with that, if your attention has not been identified, is you can make yourself hyper vigilant. Right? You can, so if I say, you know what, I'm just going to listen to the teacher, and I'm going to like, every time I think about my shoelaces, I'm going to pinch my skin, not literally, but that, like, think of that as a metaphor, right? And I'm just going to focus, and I'm going to focus. It will work, but it's exhausting, and it takes massive bandwidth. and that looks like anxiety. So oftentimes we have something like that happen. We have this feeling discouraged, self-esteem, and then depending on your circumstances, you might feel isolated and you might sort of feel ashamed or embarrassed. You can imagine how that would also produce dysregulation. This is, have you guys heard lots of lectures on the sensitive stress response, the fight or flight response? It's just in the literature, it's tons of, okay. I'm gonna blow through this, not super fast, but a little bit fast. So we've got this fight or flight response that is sort of biologically built into us. It keeps us safe when something acutely threatening is coming in front of us. Back in 10,000 years ago, it was some big tiger, or it was another tribe, or whatever it is. Today, it would be you're getting ready to cross the road. You are distracted by. I'm not even going to use a phone example. You're distracted because your 3-year-old right at that moment screamed, and you're like, "What's going on?" But you forgot to stop walking, and then you hear the horn of the bus, and you look over and you step back just in time for that 6-ton bus to not hit you. Your fight or flight response took over in that moment, and it kept you safe. It's a biological response that is all limbic system and motor cortex. What that means is it processes emotions and it gets your body to move. That's why we call it fight. Now we call it fight, flight, or freeze. Deer freeze, sometimes we freeze as well. It's a super, super adaptive response if there's a bus coming at you. It's a super, super maladaptive if what we're getting stressed out about is that we can't read. Or what we're getting stressed out about is what if the teacher's disappointed in the picture that I drew. Right? But we do experience that kind of anxiety. And when we have that kind of chronic, heightened state, that heightened cortisol response, that heightened activation of your motor cortex and your limbic system, it's exhausting. It takes a massive toll. And one of the bigger, in addition to just sort of how awful that feels, a neuropsychological cognitive consequence of that is when your fight or flight response is online, your brain is not. The decision-making part of your brain is offline. We've got really nice brain imaging research that shows that when the fight or flight response is turned on, your motor cortex is getting a lot of blood, your limbic system is getting a lot of blood, and your frontal lobes, the decision-making part of your brain, is getting very, very little blood. Problem solving doesn't work when you're anxious. You guys know this. The other thing that you know is when you're anxious, you're super inflexible. And an inflexible person, when you ask them to do something that they don't know how to do, or they don't want to do, or they're not prepared to do, or they weren't expecting to do, they're going to dysregulate. Because for them, that inflexibility is super adaptive. It gives them a sense of control because they feel like, okay, I can at least control this. You can't make me move from here. And then I feel safe because right here, I'm in charge. And what I need right now is to be in charge. And so when you try to get me to do something other than that, I'm no longer in charge. It was the only piece of control I had. Why do I want to be in control? Because I don't feel safe. And I'm looking for anything that will help me feel safe. When the fight or flight response is online, my primitive brain has taken over and I'm simply focused on being safe. Make sense? This is going to produce dysregulation when that comes in conflict with reality, that you actually do have to move from that seat and you do have to go and line up for lunch or go to bed or whatever it is. Okay. Couple things here that are worth noting. With the fight or flight response online, even if it's just turned up a little, like let's not call it full-on fight or flight, but anxiety, you're working harder because you have to deal with your inflexibility. You're managing that anxiety, which takes cognitive resources. So instead of having 100% of your bandwidth focused on the task, you've got 20% focused on managing the anxiety and the remaining 80% for the task. And if the anxiety is high, it might be opposite. 80% managing the anxiety, 20% focused on the task. And so it just makes everything a lot harder. You're going to exhaust a lot sooner. And importantly, there's going to be nothing left in the tank. Right? So I think all of you guys are parents. I'm sure you've made the same mistake I have made, which is you gave 110% at work, you got home, it was 6:30 and there's nothing left in the tank. And so what does that mean? It means that if things don't go flawlessly at home, you're going to dysregulate because you worked yourself to exhaustion. And at least what I learned as a parent, after doing that a few times, is I can't do that because I've got a day job, but I've got a far more important night job, which is my kids. And so I've got to come home with something left in the tank. That's what I'm talking about. We have to do that, and we have to teach our kids to do that over time. That's a different topic, but that's one of the ideas. But this is, in some respects, what we're asking them to do. I'm going to skip this piece of it as well. This is another slide that just sort of shows the process, right? So I'm feeling like I didn't do very well. I'm guessing the contrast here isn't very good. Sorry about that. And then you've got this internalized sense of self-doubt, loathing, I can't do it, feeling inadequate. That's going to contribute to ineffective and inefficient effort. It might lead to escape and avoidance, playing a lot of video games, not doing a lot of working on my essay, right? That kind of escape and avoidance. Emotional outbursts, right? It's time to turn off Fortnite because you've got homework to do. You can't make me. We go to the match, right? Right? But it not always. Sometimes it's just about Fortnite, and that's not this topic, right? I mean, it is kind of, but if it starts here, we understand how it gets there. Fortnite, I experience competence, I experience mastery, it's fun, my friends are there. I've got all these prizes and tokens, and I need more skins, and right, there's a whole world there. And it's not nearly as hard as writing that paragraph, where I feel like I suck at it. Yeah, it's a little crass, but that's what your kid's thinking. Okay. That's why I think, from a neuropsychological standpoint, kids dysregulate. It's probably not completely exhaustive, but I hope it's capturing a range of different reasons why. We've got the emotional ones, the self-esteem ones. We've got sort of how we process information, whether it's we process it slowly or we process it bit by bit. But what I think you really want to know is, what do we do about it? But knowing what to do about it, it makes a lot more sense if we know why it happens in the first place. There's two components to this. This is a broad framework that I think is practical, and then I'm going to try and get discrete with the last part. So let's move on to the next part. So the general approach, number one, have realistic expectations. I sort of hinted at that earlier, okay? Number two, this might be new. I haven't seen this in a lot of other talks, but develop and maintain an emotional connection. I'm going to spend some time on that. Build resilience, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that, and then support success with practical strategies. So here we go. Realistic expectations should be developmentally appropriate. Let me turn my slides so I can look at you guys instead of that. Okay. So they should be developmentally appropriate. 3 hours ago, in fact, yours might say be age appropriate. Is that what they say? Yeah. It's because I want us to be thinking about not my 8-year-old should act like an 8-year-old, but rather my 8-year-old should act like however old he actually is biologically, which is different from chronologically. So where is he developmentally? If we can figure that out, it's going to be far easier to raise him or her because we're going to have appropriate expectations. Sometimes you need a neuropsych to figure that out. Sometimes you need a therapist to figure that out. Sometimes just by having raised a lot of kids, you figured it out. But if we can anchor our expectations to that, we're going to be disappointed a lot less often. Our child's going to experience success a lot more often. This contributes to, I redshirted my kid. Do you guys know redshirting, right? So in pre-K, I had him do it again so that he's now old for grade. I wanted his brain to catch up. I was one of those guys that was 18 going on 15, and I was like, well, if he's my kid, chances are he's going to be the same, right? So I wanted him to be old for grade so that his brain had a chance to be like the other kids, so to speak. So this is what I'm talking about. It's just like, where are they developmentally? But then there's other pieces to it. If you have a learning difference, right, you might process language differently. You might process visual spatial information differently. Your attention, your ability to focus on things might be different. You may overload more quickly. We need to think about that. And then there's two other pieces I've got here. I've got temperament and frustration tolerance. So your child's temperament, how well do they roll with the punches? How adaptable are they? Some of us are just, as long as it's predictable, we do great. But if it's not predictable, boy, oh boy, everything goes sideways, right? Part of that's temperament, not all, but part of that's temperament. Just sort of, those of us that are super thrill-seeking, that are high in exploration, versus those of us that are less so. We need to think about that as we think about the sorts of challenges we put our kids through. And then frustration tolerance, that's more of the immediate waiting. Whether it's waiting for that lollipop, waiting for you to get off the phone, waiting for this line to finish, waiting to get into college, lots of waiting. Waiting for your kids to move out, maybe. Right. Okay. Remove the worry that comes with the work. This is, again, I think some of the things on here are going to be familiar and some of it's going to be new. So reasonable expectations, I think we've talked about. Mindfulness exercise. Have you guys doing these talks, do you guys know a bit about mindfulness at this point? It's in the literature. People are talking about it a lot. here's the bottom line, at least for the purposes of this talk with mindfulness. A lot of what we worry about is what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, right? It's that idea, if I don't pass this test, I'm not going to do well in this class. If I don't do well in this class, they may not advance me to Algebra 2. If they don't advance me to Algebra 2, I may not get into the right college, which means I'm never going to have a job. I'm going to disappoint my parents. They're going to die sad and miserable, and I'm going to be under the viaduct, right? That's like, right, super catastrophic thinking. All of which is because I don't know question number 3. So the idea behind mindfulness is to stay right here and right now. There's a whole bunch of ways and strategies to do it. And at this point I think there's a size for everybody. But the goal is to just focus on where you're at now and to develop that muscle in your brain to be able to do it with some consistency so that you can do it when you're in the middle of a whirlwind. You can do it when you feel like you don't know anything and your brain just sort of ran out the front door in the middle of the SAT, so that you can do something to calm yourself down and bring yourself back. So that's my pitch for mindfulness as an approach and a strategy. And like I said, there's a million different ways to do it. I'm guessing you guys at this point have heard a lot about Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset, fixed mindset. Anybody, is this completely new for anybody? Okay, so a few of you. So she's a brilliant researcher. She used to be at Columbia, now she's at Stanford. She studied elementary school kids, and what she illustrated through her research, and then there's been a whole thing that's come through with all of that over the last 15 years, is that some kids have what's called a fixed mindset. Some humans, the age doesn't really matter. The fixed mindset is, I was born endowed with a certain set of abilities and that's all I've got. And a growth mindset is, with practice, I can get better at anything. There's some nuance there, but that's what it boils down to. And of course, it's on a continuum, right? It's not like either or. But if you have a fixed mindset, every time you go into an evaluative situation, whether it's taking a test, interviewing for a job, asking someone out on a date, it's going to boil down to, fundamentally, it's a referendum on me as a person. It's not an indication of my progress thus far. Right? It's not going to be a measure of how much algebra I know. It's going to be an assessment of my worth. That's sort of what a fixed mindset implies. A growth mindset is, I go into that exam and it's, guess what, I only got a 50%. What that told me is, I've learned 50% of the material, I've got more work to do. And a true growth mindset would be, great, now I know what I need to work on, as opposed to, great, I'm never going to make it through math. We can influence this, and if this is a new concept or this is something that isn't sort of baked into how you think about stuff, I would grab her book, but then I would Google her and pick up, I think she's got an article in The Atlantic, and I think there's a couple of recent articles that are worth looking at, because she's demonstrating that the way we're baking growth mindset into different school systems is being a little bit counterproductive, and we're going to need to do some tweaking. So if this appeals to you, don't just get her book, but also Google and get some of these long-form interviews where she talks more about it. Even her TED Talk, I think she's got some updates from that I think for parents makes sense to dig into. And how about this, the good enough model? Any of you that have taken a parenting class, I hope someone said, all you need to do is be the good enough parent, not the perfect parent. There is no such thing as the perfect parent. I need to write a good enough essay. I need to do well enough on the exam. I don't need 100%. I may not even need 90%. I just need to do well enough to keep moving on. If we can sort of imbue that in some way, have a little tolerance for forgetting to carry the one or dot the I or cross the T or something like that, it's just going to create a little bit of space to be human, to make errors, to be fallible. And if we've got a child who's sensitive, a child who dysregulates easily, if we can just give that a little bit more bandwidth, they'll be massively more successful in life, because they're going to focus on getting things done instead of focusing on getting this one thing done absolutely perfectly without being able to take into account the other 19 things you've got to do. As adults, you guys know this. You have to cut corners someplace. Right? I remember when I was at NIH, there was this tension, right? Who do I want to disappoint more, my boss or my child? Right? Because there's not enough hours in the day to do everything perfectly. And so this is a tension that we wrestle with, all of us do. And it's figuring that out. And I think it starts here with, can we do it well enough? I don't want to disappoint my boss enough that she's in a lurch or she's upset with me, but I am going to disappoint her to say, you know what, I'm going to get it done tomorrow because it's my daughter's whatever kind of thing. It's helping our kids understand that we have to balance those kinds of things. But I do think that this ties back to dysregulation, because when we feel pressure, when we feel like we're up against a wall, is when things go sideways. And if we have a little bit of flexibility to be imperfect, I think it helps. This is big picture stuff, it's not in the moment stuff, but if we can infuse this, I think we're sort of paying into the kitty, I don't quite have the right metaphor, down the line. Just a slide to illustrate the same idea. Emotional connection. I told you I was going to spend a little time on this. Here's what happens. When you feel, so just think about this in your own life. The boss that you know has your back no matter what, versus the boss that is hypercritical, that is carping, that makes it hard for you to really do your best. Think about that with your friends, with the relationships you've had. Think about it all the way back to your own childhood, to the teacher that inspired you, that you thought loved you, cared about you, was that resilience factor in your life, versus the one that you just thought had it out for you. And then think about how hard you were willing to work and whether you really showed your best work under each of those circumstances. This is emotional connection. If you know I've got your back, if you know we're in it together, if you know that success or failure, we're going to get through this together, you're going to have bandwidth to really perform and navigate it differently than if it's like I'm looking over you and I'm just waiting for you to make a mistake and I've got that switch and I'm going to smack your wrists or I'm going to smack the desk, but right, like this is the difference. Emotional connection, no emotional connection. Some of this I'm being metaphorical, but I hope you guys are getting the idea here. Building that connection requires an investment, I think, every day or as often as you can do. A few of the points up here are things you can do every day. A few of them are things you can do in the moment. And we're going to sort of toggle between some of those. So one way you can build bandwidth is when your kid's coming apart, if you can stay calm. And I promise that 100% of the time you're not going to do that, but doing it as often as you can, sort of leaving something in the tank when you get home, choosing a time to do homework when you also have bandwidth, things like that is what I'm talking about. But we all make those, we can't always be calm all the time. Kids they're relentless. So there's times where they're just going to outlast you. So trying to be a non-anxious presence, right? So my daughter completely melting down about getting this thing taped onto the piece of paper just right, and instead of being like, it's not a big deal, just like get it done, let's move on, right? That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is it's not quite right. You're still off by a little, right? And a third way to do it would be, it's okay. We're going to get it, and then we're going to give her time, and we're going to sort of either help jostle her or give her some reassurance that the teacher is going to be happy with it, even if it is off by a little bit. A non-anxious presence, providing some reassurance, some listening, a softer tone, slowing down our speech. I'll get to some of those in a minute. These are just more generic. Time in. This is a concept that's in a lot of the sort of parent talks. It's just this idea is you specifically designate time that you're enjoying with your son or daughter, just where you're connecting with them. Child-directed activity, no demands placed on them. This isn't the time where we're going to help them be a more strategic chess player unless they're asking you for that advice, right? Unless they're saying, well, now, Dad, what do I do? Right? That kind of a thing. This is where we're just there to be with them, to experience the moment. It can be reading a story, going for a walk, making cookies. It doesn't matter. But to do that, you're investing in that relationship, building that connection, building that trust and deepening it. Catching them being good, I think, makes sense. And then this is probably the hardest, right? A flexible approach. So I sat down to help you get your homework done, and we're working on math. And now we're derailed, and now it's late. We're now 30 minutes past bedtime. The math is only halfway done. You're melting down about the math. Guess what? It's not about the math anymore. We as the grown-up in the room, we have to be flexible to say this is no longer about the math. Now it's about something else. It's about whether it's about just emotional connection, whether it's about managing anxiety, whether it's about task prioritization, whether it's about regrouping and saying, you know what, I'm going to get you up a half hour early tomorrow morning. I know your brain works a lot better then, and I know we're going to get through it together. Sometimes your kid will hear that and go to bed, and sometimes you're still going to be in the weeds with them. But this is what I'm talking about with switching tasks midstream. Okay. Some general advice here. Your kid's going to have more resilience, is going to have more capacity to regulate if they're well fed, well slept, that they have consistency and expectation. Structure makes a huge difference. I know what I want to talk about here. So distracting or stress reducing. So oftentimes we think about these escape activities as somehow stress reducing. Certain things are absolutely stress reducing. Yoga, meditation, exercise. For the right person, art, whether it's art like you see on the walls here, or whatever form of art, or journaling, These can be modes of expression, they can be stress reducing, they can be rejuvenating. Screens aren't, whether you're watching TV, playing a video game. A screen could be in the thinnest of circumstances. If I'm talking with my friend and I'm feeling understood and supported by my friend, maybe then. But otherwise they're not. They're a distraction, they're an escape, they feel good, but they're not putting gas in the tank. They're not reducing that stress, they're not bleeding it off. Your kiddo does not understand that, I guarantee. And we need to help them understand that. Okay. Empowerment, having a sense of control, giving your kiddo as much control as possible. Looking at the time, I'm not going to spend a ton on this slide, but the idea for the first part is to give them as much choice as we can. You guys have heard this in other talks. This is sort of talked about a lot. This one I don't hear as much about. I think this is huge. If this interests you, pick up Wendy Mogul's book, Blessing of a Skin Knee. It's a pretty easy read, and it really lays out a coherent argument for why when your kiddo skins his knee, metaphorically or literally, let him put a Band-Aid on it himself. Teach him the resilience of when, it's all of these things we learned as kids, right? If you fall off the bike, get back on it, right? Like all of these axioms. But what it boils down to is what you're teaching your child is self-reliance and perseverance. You're not withholding love. You're like, if it's a broken arm, you're going to help and you're going to be there and you're going to kiss it better and take him to the hospital and all of that stuff. But if it's a skinned knee, you're going to show him where the Band-Aids are and you're going to say, get back there and have fun. That's the idea. It's unpacked more thoroughly there. This was also added just a couple of hours ago. Failure is an option. Don't punish, celebrate learning. The idea here is we learn from our mistakes. And if depending on the temperament of our child and depending on the feedback they've gotten from parents, from educators, from coaches, they may feel like failure is the worst possible outcome. But we learn from failure. We don't learn that much when we landed on top. When we were the top performing student in the class, when we were the most competitive tennis player, whatever it is, we don't usually learn very much other than, wow, look how good I did. It's understanding where things broke down is where we learn. And from that standpoint, failure is the only way to do that kind of learning. And so we want to sort of shift the expectations there as much as we can. Okay. Building the resilience muscle. So I've got this for younger kids and older kids. This comes from a book called Raising Resilience from, I can't think of his first name, Willard. I found it. It's mindfulness-based strategies, but I really liked it a lot. The idea here, here's how I'm framing all of this. I think about dysregulation as one component of it is having poor frustration tolerance, difficulty coping with adversity of one sort or another. And I think one of the most common kinds of adversity we struggle with is being able to wait. Being able to delay gratification, right? One of the really attractive things about screens is it's instant. I'm the same way. I get a new phone because the hang time on my current phone's 3 seconds. I'm like, I don't have 3 seconds, right? It's easy to just get really wrapped up into this. I can't believe Netflix isn't streaming right now. Remember when we had Blockbuster Video and sometimes it was checked out and we might have to come back a couple weeks later, right? Like a completely different landscape. We learn frustration tolerance, right? When you guys were kids, when I was a kid, and we went on a car drive, what did we do? We said, are we there yet? And they said, don't make me pull this car over. But what we learned in that process is how to wait. What we do now is we throw an iPad in front of them. Not you guys, but in general, that's what happens, right? Right? We're not teaching patience. We're not teaching frustration tolerance. It's a muscle that needs to be developed and exercised. And there's a whole host of ways to do it. And so there are a couple of examples. So as I put this slide together, what I wanted to think about is how can you do this already? Like not how can I add one more thing to your to-do list, but rather you have to wait in line. You have to wait for food at a restaurant. You are sometimes talking to your friend or to your spouse or whatever, and your kid's sitting there. These are all situations that happen every day already. Can we leverage these situations to build patience, to build frustration tolerance? I think we can. So the idea here is when we're waiting in line, we're not going to hand them a screen. We're going to teach them how to wait. And then there's a whole bunch of ways to do it. We can play a game. One of the examples from the book was if we're waiting in a long line just between the two of us, we can make up stories about the people walking by. The person that's got some big heavy backpack, maybe he's trekking through and, like something like that. We're just using our creativity and our ingenuity to find ways to pass the time. But what we're doing is we're building frustration tolerance. At least I think we are. And I think that will tie back to exercising a muscle that will build inoculate to some degree against dysregulation. With older kids, we need to be more sophisticated. So then we've got project-based learning in areas of interest. I think that's a big deal. So let's build something in the backyard where we have to do it in multiple parts. We can't just get it done in the next 2 hours. It's something we're going to need to do over time. We need to get some parts, we need to let it set, we need to get some more parts. In 3 months, we'll know. Gardening, or you can use your own creativity to think about that, but if we invite that in, things that require patience and persistence and tenacity, and the way we get buy-in is we make it fun by doing it in an area of interest. Sports and musical instruments also can really serve that purpose. There's a lot that goes into getting yourself good enough for the winter concert, or good enough to play in the finals, or even to just get to the playoffs. It's teaching that investing now pays off down the line. Okay. I covered this. I do recommend to make it easier on you, just have the screen not be there. If you're gonna like go all in with this, like the phone's just not available. The iPad's not available. I'm not advising this if you've got a 6-hour drive. I'm advising this when you're going 25 minutes down the street and there might be traffic, so that 25 minutes might become 40 minutes. It's like, okay, well, there are no screens. We're gonna have to figure it out. But this is what I meant by having the screen not available. Two more ideas on this slide that I think are worth commenting on. This idea of active distraction and focusing on a goal. So if you're having a super hard time waiting, what's happening in part is your amygdala, the emotion part of your brain, is really busy and active. So if I'm 3 years old and I just can't wait to get that ice cream cone, what I'm thinking about is how good that bubblegum flavored ice cream is going to taste, it dripping down my hand, and there's going to be this whole thing with it that's all emotional and around just the experience of it. But if I can shift it a bit, if I can shift it to shape, to color, I'm bringing in the verbal part of my brain. I'm bringing in other parts of my brain. I'm quieting the emotion part of my brain, which might make it a little bit easier for me to wait. That's the idea. And then focusing on a goal, right? So this isn't waiting for an ice cream cone. This is like having to wait to get something really cool, and just focusing on how great it will be once, if I'm saving $20 a week or $20 a month to get that really cool thing, focusing on just how amazing it's going to be when I'm riding that bicycle or whatever it is. But shifting from the immediate, I really want to spend that $20 to get this thing right now, but I thought you were waiting to get this thing. I thought you were saving for this other thing. Helping them to shift and to really make that prize that they're going for more powerful in their mind. Verbal encoding is another strategy. So kind of as an oversimplification, the verbal part of your mind is linear, it's temporal, it is time dependent. There's a sense of start and stop. The emotional part of your brain, the creative part of your brain, it tends to be timeless. It tends to be everything. When you experience, just think of some super intense emotion you've experienced, whether it was anger or anxiety or falling in love, any of those kinds of things. If you put yourself in that state, what you'll remember is it felt just all-encompassing. It went everywhere. And it felt like it was going to be permanent. That's what the experience of an intense emotion is like. And if we can bring words to it, that linear part of your brain engages and gets online. This is going to sound antithetical to what I'm going to say in a little while, which is use fewer words, but there's ways to sort of balance that. If you guys have questions about this, I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm going to keep going. This is another way to think about what's reasonable. Vygotsky is this great developmental psychologist that really did a brilliant job of describing what it's like to teach a child in an area where they're developmentally ready to learn versus teaching them something that they're not ready to learn. And I'm just going to leave it at that. We want to start with what can they do. You guys can do tons of modeling. I encourage this. When you're losing it, go back and unpack it. If you come apart, explain to your kiddos what happened. Not in a defensive, sort of self-justifying sort of way, but like, you know what? I came home from work completely exhausted, mistake number one. And then I didn't realize you had all these homework things going on. And so when you told me you did, I was like, really? You're telling me now at 9:30 at night? Mistake number two, right? And then I came apart because I didn't do blah, 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 whatever it is. I didn't take time. I didn't. So you're living out loud. You're modeling, here's the things that went wrong. If I'm doing it well, then you can model that as well. You know, I got home late. I didn't know you had homework, but I know that this was important. I know that you usually have homework on Thursdays, and so that reminded me, and so then I shifted, right? Like like you're living out loud. You're modeling how you're adapting and making sense of what's taking place. Okay. Oh, and then this part, right? So again, I know you guys don't do this, but when you're at a restaurant, you just keep your phone in your pocket or in your purse, and you're modeling, not just like, okay, we're waiting for the food, let's get on our phone. Okay, specific strategies. So I think we're sort of at that hour mark. We have about a half hour left. I'm going to try to do this in, say, 10 minutes, and then we'll still have 20 minutes or so for questions. Are you guys okay with that? Yep. Okay. All right. I don't know how many slides moved while I was talking. Okay. So in terms of specific strategies, let's start with specifically when do we intervene. This comes from a book by Brenda Smith-Miles. I think this is 100% true. If you've ever had your child completely come apart, you know they are inaccessible, not reachable. Don't do any sort of problem solving in that moment. Get them through it, whatever it's going to take to get them through it. And then we're going to go back and think about the strategies that I've been talking about, either earlier, like you see it's coming, but we're not there yet, they're still accessible, or afterwards, right? So they completely lose it, they've come apart. Depending on your child, depending on the situation, that recovery might be a minute, it might be a day, it just depends. But at some point, they're going to be over it, and then you're going to go back and you're going to work on these strategies. But think about that. You guys are no different, right? I don't know anyone that's different. Like in the middle of you completely coming apart, that's the time for someone to give you some coaching. Unless it's like super concrete coaching, like breathe, just breathe, right? Like something simple like that. Otherwise, anything that's more sophisticated than really trying to calm the nervous system with something like that, why don't you go for a walk? Don't tell me what to do. I know what, right? Like that's how it's going to go, right? But something simple like breathe might work, especially if it's been practiced in advance. Otherwise, like sort of take inventory and realize that your child's not unique and that they're not accessible in the middle of a meltdown. Okay, this is hard. I'm just going to tell you right now, this is hard. But it's worth trying to do. So, and in this case, I should say, I probably don't literally mean right here in the middle of a meltdown. I'm probably talking about where did my thing go? Like probably here or here, okay? The easiest way, so when you've got a meltdown taking place, you have only one avenue forward, and that's to reconnect with your child. There is no other avenue because they're not available for problem solving. They're not going to take in any information. An old mentor of mine used to say, you can't argue with the limbic system, and you can't. Limbic systems are not rational, they're not reasonable, they're emotional. Emotions, remember, they're big, they're all-encompassing, they last forever. Like in the moment you're experiencing it, you feel like this anger is permanent. It's not, but that's how it feels. Which means you have to negotiate with the limbic system, but you can't do that through logic. You have to do that through emotion. So you're going to try to connect with them. You're going to try to appeal to the emotions. The way to do that, and this is going to look different depending on whether it's a 3-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 15-year-old, developmentally, not chronologically, is you're going to try to first put yourself in their shoes. Why are they coming apart? Why is everything going sideways? What would it be like for me to be there with them? What would it be like if I was inside their head, inside their shoes? What is the pain that they're experiencing? What is the frustration? What is the distress that they're experiencing? I want to try to feel that, and then I want to try to help them understand that I got it. So I need to do that with my imagination, but then I need to let them say whatever it is they're going to say. I need to hear it. I need to repeat it so they understand. It's not a verbatim repeating, but it's like my daughter this morning, there was a playground situation with the monkey bars and like this whole thing. And the idea here is I need to say, it sounds like you felt like she was super mean and didn't listen to you at all. And then she did it again and again and again. And it sounds awful. Something like that, all right? I don't have to do the whole thing, right? She went for 45 seconds. Hopefully I went for 10. But I'm trying to capture just the essence of it. And hopefully my tone of voice, the look on my face, the way I'm touching her, she's feeling like I get it. She's feeling empathized with. That's where we have to go in the middle of a meltdown. We have to figure out how do we connect emotionally. And the strategy, this is a well-developed approach that's effective. It comes out of couples therapy, but it works with any relationship, is they need to feel heard. They need to get that they felt heard, so repeating what they said, and then empathize with the emotion. This sounds so awful. I'm so sorry. That kind of a thing, right? So they feel validated. They feel understood. Once that happens, and then things are settled, we can move on to problem solving. But in the moment, you can't. They're not there. They're upset. It's like, well, why didn't you just do this? It's like, did you not hear me? I'm melting down right now, right? Like, that's what we need to get to. Okay, new specific strategy, show, don't tell. This is sort of a living out loud type thing. So we're gonna model what we want to do. The see one, do one, teach one comes out of hospital practice, sort of residents. I'm gonna watch you suture that person, and then you're gonna watch me suture that person, and then I'm gonna teach the next person how to suture that person. That's the idea. And so oftentimes for these types of things, we need to show, and then show, and then show. We might need to show 100 times, 1,000 times, but we're gonna show it. And we're going to narrate when we can, but we're going to model as much as we can. Another way to talk about it, sort of the Unstuck and On Target curriculum talks about it this way. We're going to scaffold, we're going to fade, and then we're going to generalize, which means we're going to help them be successful. We're going to fade that scaffolding as they experience more success, and then we're going to help them generalize it to new settings and situations. So a general principle that I'm hoping you guys can think of application to. And you're going to focus on the positive as much as you can. I've talked about this modeling self-regulation. I'm just taking it a step further, not just put your phone down, but model getting enough sleep, model getting exercise, model I got up this morning and I didn't just watch sports all morning. I got up this morning, I did the things I was supposed to do. I put the DVR on so I didn't miss the football game, but I got my things done. And now I'm gonna relax and do something fun. That idea. If we're trying to teach our kids first work then play, model first work then play. Instill self-regulation as a family value. So when you dysregulate, own it. Right? The more you can own your own flaws, your own shortcomings, you can be apologetic, but don't be defensive about it. The more you allow your child to be human. You acknowledging that you dysregulate sometimes isn't going to give them permission to dysregulate. It's going to give them permission to be human. It's going to give them permission to be flawed, which they are, just like I am. And it's going to make it easier for them to recover because they're not going to feel like they're also disappointing you. They're going to feel like, wow, this was really hard, and I can't believe I came apart, and I'm going to try again next time. And it stops there as opposed to, and now mom's going to be so disappointed in me and I can't believe I did it again. And, I bet she wishes I was never born, right? Like these are things our kids think. And we're going to try to limit that through some of this kind of modeling. I love this phrase, don't walk your child through the candy store and then ask them to eat broccoli. So again, self-regulation idea, first work, then play, first your vegetables, then dessert. Why do we teach that? Why do we emphasize that? We're teaching moderation, we're teaching self-regulation, we're teaching temperance sort of as a concept, just super concretely. This really is a big deal. When somebody's melting down, I don't care if they've got the highest vocabulary and the biggest verbal IQ you've ever encountered, or they really struggle to talk. It's hard to process words when you're distressed and upset. Do your very best to turn that paragraph into a sentence, turn that sentence into a phrase. Sometimes take it a step farther and write it down. Depending on your child, if you write it down, they're just going to tear up that paper and scream at you. Just depends on your child. But the idea is fewer words. It will settle them. Because what you're doing when you add more words is you're adding to the overload. If you're emotionally overloaded, I guarantee you're cognitively overloaded. Cognitive overload comes first, emotion overload comes second. That's always the case. So if we're already overloaded, we don't need to then say, I'd like you to read Ulysses while you're melting down, right? It just doesn't work like that. Using scripts helps. So any of you that have taken your kiddo through a program that helps with regulation, a heavy component of these programs is to use scripts. These are catchphrases that teach a concept or an idea when you're calm, when you're relaxed. You practice it, you master it, and then you apply it in the setting or situation where you're now melting down. It sounds like this is where we need a plan B. Is this a big deal or a little deal? These are scripts from the Unstuck curriculum that some of you might have heard of. Nuances in the middle of a firestorm like this, nuance isn't going to be there, and so you're going to want to be concrete. This is a slide about structure. The more structured you are, the better off they're going to be. I think this is straightforward. I'm going to skip this one too. This is the only commercial I'm going to give tonight. So Unstuck and On Target for kids who struggle with regulation. It's a great curriculum to teach flexibility and to teach problem solving and to teach sort of dealing with information overload. The curriculum exists for 2nd to 5th graders, it exists for middle school students, and it exists for high school students. We're developing it for post-high school. And Monica Werner, who is one of the authors of the curriculum, she works in our group and she runs this program. So if this is something that you really struggle with, the great thing about the Unstuck curriculum is you get coached in how to use the program and apply it while your child is being trained in the program. So they go through all sorts of age-appropriate exercises to learn the concepts and ideas. You're being taught how to apply it in everyday life, how to generalize those skills, how to leverage the program. So in your handout, you can go to the website if you want to know more about it. Okay, supporting slow processing. This is because of time, something I'm just also going to skip over. I think this is straightforward. Monitoring overload. We've talked about this in a bunch of different ways already. This just comes back to the same bottom line. If you're overloaded, you're not available for learning. So if you see your child overload or dysregulate, they're not going to hear you anymore. Motivation's a big deal. So there's a few different ways to do it. You can get buy-in by giving as many choices as possible. This is just standard parenting practices. Give control wherever possible. I need you to put on a shirt. I don't actually care what color. I'm not going to negotiate putting on a shirt. I'm going to say, do you want the red one or the blue one? Perception of choice. What you want is the shirt on. You don't care what color. And then you just sort of apply that logic forward. These are the last 2 slides. So the first one is, here are common pitfalls that you're likely to run into. You guys are not aligned on the goal. You want to get the math homework done. It's not what your child wants. You don't understand what's motivating them. You're paying attention to the wrong thing. You're paying attention to the error on the math homework, not that the child has broken 4 pencils in the last 10 minutes. That idea, okay? Are you being flexible? Are you accepting incremental success? I understand we don't have mastery, but is it better than it was last week? Let's celebrate that. Especially if you have a child with a learning difference, especially if you have a child that struggles with regulation, I want you to do whatever you can to think about this as a marathon where you need to have the stamina to get to mile 26, which may not be until they're in their 20s. And the only way your child's going to get there is if at each step along the way you can look back and say, wow, we've come a long way, instead of looking forward and saying, well, we're still just at mile 3. We've already come 3 miles. Sort of metaphorically, try to think of it like that. But try to catch whatever success you can. It makes a difference for them and for you. If you feel like you're being successful, you're going to work harder. Are you, I love this as an idea, are you building a bank of successes? I call these touchstone moments. You guys have these. If you think back into your childhood, you have these salient moments in your life where something significant happened, both positive and negative. When your child experiences something big, like they finally crossed a milestone, celebrate it, draw attention to it. And not just, you did it, that's so great, that's good, but wow, you worked so hard, I love how you, and then whatever it is, the thing you've been working on, you push past that, something discrete and focused that they care about, that's tied to the skill you want to see them develop, that they feel control over. We talked about the non-crisis, and then building up your credibility. I'm not going to focus on that too much right now. Here's my bottom line for you guys. Children fundamentally need to feel understood. They will work harder. Every child works harder when they have a sense of connection. My day job, I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist. I test kids all day long, whether they're 3 years old or 25 years old. They will work harder for me if they like me, if they feel like I care about them, if I'm invested in them, if they experience a sense of connection. It's dramatically more powerful than a token economy, than getting like their favorite ever remote control car at the end of the testing experience. Sometimes we need to do that, and that's okay. But if I can get their buy-in by having just a connection with them, it's completely different. It's just a different ballgame completely. Children, whether they're 5 or 25, when they're treated respectfully and like a partner. That doesn't mean I'm going to talk to my 5-year-old the way I'm going to talk to my wife, but it is that I'm going to do what I can to pay respect to my 5-year-old in a way that I think is appropriate. I'm going to try very hard to not talk down to them. I'm going to talk using language that's developmentally appropriate, but in a way that conveys respect as much as I can. Kids feel that. You guys feel it the same way, I'm sure. And then they need to believe in themselves. I think that's straightforward. And then they pick up on your stress. I'm sure you guys know this as well. When you're stressed, they're stressed. Emotion is contagious, especially for kids. And for kids that dysregulate, usually they're keying off of what's going on around them. that's not, that came out a little bit differently. If you get amped up and sort of really animated, they're probably going to amp up with you. If you're calm, cool, and collected, it's going to be easier for them to be calm, cool, and collected. You could be doing everything right and they could still totally dysregulate. So the question is about dealing with screens, and I'm assuming screen overuse with a high school kid. There's a whole host of things on this. This is sort of its own topic and its own talk, but a few specific things. Number one is to think about, for a high school kid, I would actually do everything I can to draw him into an adult conversation about it. Sort of, do you control the screen or does it control you? And to try to get past platitudes like that, but to like really think meaningfully and granularly about it. If it's like, I'm getting all my homework done, I'm getting to sleep, I'm getting the chores done, why do you care? Well, I hope that you still care, because if the only hobby and interest you have is your screen, that ends up being a fairly one-dimensional adult life. We need to have a broader range of skills, even in our avocational life, in our hobbies. So that would be one piece. Another piece would be to incentivize around the concept of first work, then play. How you apply that is going to vary depending on your specific situation. And then the third one, I think, is to have a predetermined expectation. So in some households, there's not sort of this idea that we should limit our screen use to an hour a day or to 30 minutes a day. There's not like a frame like that. And so setting sort of what would be a reasonable experience with screens. What are we working toward, and what does that look like? Really trying to draw, to get, with a high school kid, I would do everything I can to get buy-in. Sometimes you can't. That's a whole other topic, but that's where I would start. So the question is about sort of, okay, I can put screen limits on and I can just have total control. You get it for these 30 minutes and then I use technology that sort of cuts it off. Am I teaching self-regulation that way? It's a huge question I have as well, and I think it depends on the age and the maturity of the child. And a really important piece of this is, as you make the transition out of your house, especially in the 2 years before they go, and I do mean the 2 years before they go, not the 3 months, is to do what you can to have your life at home to look a lot like college. And I don't mean like you're up till 5 in the morning and like, I don't mean like that. I mean like you're giving them control over homework, over screen use. You're expecting them to do their own laundry, to maintain their bedroom in ways that you'd expect them to do on campus, to the extent that you can. How you get to that, from the only way I can manage screens is by using technology to cut it off after 30 minutes is a journey. But I would invite them to take more and more control. And I would take a trial and error approach. Again, with the screen questions, sometimes we're dealing with pretty hardcore screen addiction, and then we need to go into a pretty complex protocol to deal with it. If we're dealing with, I'm having mild tantrums and I'm just sick of telling them to get off, and now it was 8, now it's 8:15, and I just don't want to tell them 23 times, so I'm using technology. In those sorts of situations, I would be looking for ways to give them 5 more minutes tomorrow if today they got themselves off after 30 minutes. If they can. So what I want to do is give them an incentive for managing it themselves, and that is to give more autonomy, more freedom the next day. And then I usually use a consequence that's pretty significant if we have a blow up. So if it's like you get 30 minutes today and you violated that, well, okay, we'll try again tomorrow for 30 minutes. If they didn't violate it, then you get 35 minutes, that idea. And then the next day it doesn't become 40 minutes, it just stays at 35 minutes. Every day you get yourself off, it stays at 35 minutes. But let's say at 30 minutes I say, buddy, you gotta get off. And it's a temper tantrum. It's like, oh, you're not gonna get any tomorrow. If it's a big temper tantrum, like they hit you, or they threw something, and you sort of define these rules in advance, then it might be you lose it for a week. I don't want it to be draconian to the extent that it's like, okay, that's it, the switch goes in the trash, because what opportunity is there for learning, right? You don't recover from that. There's opportunity for learning if we take it away for a few days. It's like, now we try again. That's what I would work toward. So the question, I think the question is, how do we foster initiative? How do we get kids to sort of want to go learn the trumpet, to want to go play soccer, to want to do an art and craft project, to get on their bicycle, when the only sort of initiative we're seeing right now is screen related. And I would say that's... How does that fit in with this whole neurological profile? I think it ties to dysregulation, to be quite honest. I think it goes back to immediate gratification. So the thing that's so attractive about screens is it's right now. I've read maybe only one article, but through the eyes of a Google engineer whose job was to keep you on Google as long as possible. Right? You have a hundreds of billion-dollar infrastructure that's designed to keep you on that screen as long as possible. There are behavioral specialists, all kinds of people that are looking to find ways to use partial reinforcement, to use all kinds of carrots and sticks to keep you here as long as you can. Like, the battle is enormous. What we want to teach is how to delay gratification. And what I would encourage as much as possible is to have an aspect of life be where there is no immediate gratification. You have to work toward it. But here's the thing. I don't think if the alternative is, I'd really like you to go take up soccer, but the alternative is you can play video games, you're going to lose that battle 100% of the time. It needs to be the alternative is to stare at the wall. Right? I mean, there is no... So the good thing about us as kids being told, we'll get there when we get there and don't make me pull this car over and all of that, is we had ample opportunity to be creative because we had no choice. What did we have in the car with us? We had the stupid game where we have to get the numbers all lined up, which we got tired of really, really quickly. And then the only thing we had left was either poking our sibling, right, or our imagination. And so it's creating the framework for imagination, and that is to remove the immediate gratification. Again, the specifics, how you make that happen, gets more complex, but I think that's how it ties in. I think part of our challenge with dysregulation is immediate gratification, not only, but also. So the question here is sort of, again, thinking about screens and thinking about, in this case, it sounds like a young adult that's on screens from morning to night. Is this just immediate gratification? Is this avoidance? Is this anxiety? What is it? What I would say is yes, meaning it can be any of those things, and and depending on his circumstances, it could be a combination or it could be one or more of them. I realize that's not a very satisfying answer, but I can think of immediately think of people I've talked to, in my practice this week that would fit each of the scenarios you offered. Yeah. So the question is, how do we support a child with slow processing speed? It's relatively more straightforward. How to support a child that might have a reading difference or might have an attention issue. It's the volume of information when it comes in. So this is going to be previewing. It's going to be giving what I call lead time and wait time. So if the teacher's going to call on the class to do things, and it's going to be not raise your hand, but I'm going to call on you and you and you, then before I do that, I'm going to say, okay, class, I'm going to ask you, each of you or I'm going to ask some of you to answer the following question. And if you're the one that has slow processing speed, I'm going to make sure I call on you third or fourth or fifth. But you know what I'm going to ask you, and you've got time to formulate and think about what you want to say. That's lead time. Wait time is... Now that I've asked you the question, I don't rush you, I give you time. The single worst thing you can do for someone that has slow processing speed is you can rush them. It's only going to slow them down. Come on, we got to go. It's going to slow down things even more. And then on the output side, it's extended time for wherever they need extended time. And it's really recognizing this is simply to allow them to do because their output is slower, to do the same as the person sitting next to them. They just need more time to demonstrate the same ability. So again, for the camera, I'm trying to distill the question, but it's around a student here at lab that's in the middle school years, that when he's interacting with students kids outside of lab, and he may process information more slowly, or he may respond in a different way. He's feeling self-conscious, I guess, about that, and sort of how do we help him to navigate that? Is that a fair summary? Yeah. Okay. So it's great that he already has an understanding that he has a learning difference. I would try to help him. I would do what I can to normalize it. And as by metaphor, I hope you don't feel bad that you wear glasses, but rather you feel fortunate to know that I understand that without these glasses things are blurry, as opposed to this is just how the world is. Excuse me. And it would be to say, I have these learning differences, but we all have a difference in one way or another, and some differences require more effort and work and whatever to compensate than others, but this is who you are, and to sort of have a way to just sort of like be at peace with it. And It doesn't mean that he's not going to be in situations where he's misunderstood or somebody's a jerk or somebody's insensitive. That's going to happen, but it's to just work through that process. And depending on the degree to which that like really troubles him, and he comes home and he's angry and he's sullen and the whole thing, a therapist to really help him like really be okay with who he is, and you know, as one piece. Another piece I think is to try to, depending on what his specific learning difference is to really try to help him have genuine mentors that were in the same boat. So I'm going to use reading challenges as an example of this. There's an organization that I think was started in England called Made by Dyslexia. Have any of you guys heard of this? Okay, I'm seeing a few head shakes. So this is an example of an organization that really celebrates dyslexia. Their video on you know, is like a 3-minute video. It features Richard Branson and a few others really talking about how their dyslexia, yeah, it makes reading harder, but then there's all these other attributes that they have. They're more likely to be entrepreneurial, and there's a few other things like that. And it's not, I wouldn't say that every difference that you might have in learning is, we can easily point to a corollary where it's a strength, where in this case reading, the corollary strength is entrepreneurship. You know, with autism or Asperger's, the corollary strength is to develop deep expertise and have amazing attention to detail, right? We can't always draw those parallels, but if we can still find some sort of a model, not a literal mentor, but like an icon to help them sort of get, you know, yeah, you're different, but that's okay. And this person was different as well, and they figured it out, and together we'll figure it out. Something like that. So the question is, how do you know when you need to go from strategies to medication? So the answer is individual for each family. The way I think it through is, one, if we have an accurate understanding of the problem, and we have tried behavioral strategies, so we've tried classroom accommodations, we've tried various strategies at home, and whatever the reason is that we're struggling, so let's use ADHD as an example, you know, we've got maximum supports and accommodations, we've got, you know, the whole 9 yards, and we're still struggling, and so the child is suffering academically or emotionally, you know, i.e. anxiety or low self-esteem, or suffering socially, like he can't seem to not poke his, you know, his neighbor kind of thing, and we've tried everything else. I would say, okay, we need to take the next step. And especially understanding that untreated, left unaddressed, even with all of those supports, that the downstream consequences are pretty significant psychologically. But that's, again, it's individualized, but that's usually the approach I take. So the question is, in this case, a 7-year-old girl who really loves stairs and water features, and it makes it really hard to go places where those things exist because she just wants to spend all of her time there, and if she's steered away from that, I guess she melts down. Okay. So what do we do about that? Number one is we want to have a really big incentive for walking past the stairs or past the water feature. And the incentive doesn't need to be like a gallon of ice cream, right? It can just be, you know, something that's scaled. We want to plan it in advance. You know, sweetie, I want to go to the mall today because I know that you really love Build-A-Bear. I'm just going to make this up. You really love Build-A-Bear, and I'd love to take you there, but here's the thing. When we go, we're not going to be able to stop at the fountain at all. And if you can do that, then we'll be able to go into Build-A-Bear. And if not, we're going to have to go back home to sort of help her with that. And if that's just too big, like the chances of her being successful are 0%, then we need to do something smaller. Like maybe there's a small little fountain that she likes that's near your house, and you guys can practice walking by it. And practice walking by it with the idea that you know, there's a whole bunch of things out there in the world I want you to see, and if we can't see those things because of the fountain, that's not going to work. And like to try to just help her think of like puppy dogs and whatever, you know, whatever other things are really cool that she also would care about but she's not drawn to, and say, I really want you to be able to go and visit whatever those things are. So let's practice walking past the fountain. Something like that. So we preview it, we give a reward, and then we practice it at a scale that she seems where she can experience some success. Yeah. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.